When I saw the conversation that surrounded the pilot of The Amazing Digital Circus, I was conflicted on it. While I did think that some of the praise for it was a little overblown and out of left field, I ultimately agreed that it was a fun pilot with a lot of potential. So I was surprised to see just how popular the pilot became and how many people treated it like the holy grail of entertainment. However, I figured that it was just because it was the shiny new thing, and conversation surrounding it would temper as it grew older. However, it didn't. When the second episode released, I was a part of the majority that thought it was a masterpiece. It managed to be bright, fun, and surprisingly emotional. While there were a few things that felt a little odd considering where we had left off with the pilot, most of my issues with the episode were small enough that I could overlook them and enjoy it as it was, and I was excited to see what the show had in store for us. Episode 3 was confusing. It shelved over half the cast in exchange for a boring story that ended in an unsatisfying exposition dump, and it just wasn't funny or fun at all. I couldn't get myself to like the episode, but when I looked around for discussion about it, all I saw was people praising it. They called it scary because one of the characters' eyes started glowing for a couple of seconds. They called it emotional because of an exposition dump lazily stapled onto the end. They called it good. I was incredibly confused by this and felt the need to get my feelings out, but didn't. It felt like being in an episode of Black Mirror, seeing people endlessly glaze this thing that I just saw as heavily flawed. I looked around and figured that if this many people were glazing it, praising it, then it had to be good. Right? So I just kept my head down and didn't say anything too controversial. I went along with the crowd because I didn't want to be known as the person with the unpopular opinion. Episode 4 was the episode that broke me. It was slow, boring, unfunny, shoved in random characters that didn't have to be there, and provided nothing to the overall show. I looked long and hard for people who shared my opinions, yet once again, most of the discussion around this episode was purely positive, with people only really acknowledging its flaws when they were telling people not to criticize it. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay silent. All of the little grievances I had had with the show built up to a boiling point, and I had to say something. I couldn't just make a post, and a review of the episode would only get lost in the shuffle. No, I had to make a video. A massive video detailing all of my problems with the show up to this point, and that's what this video is here. Every criticism, critique, nitpick, and pet peeve I've ever had about the show will all be laid bare right here. This will be the longest video I've posted to date, so sit back and relax as I go over the many flaws of the Amazing Digital Circus. The characters are one of the most praised elements of the show, with people often complimenting them on how deep and complex they are. However, when you watch the show outside of a fandom lens, you realize that these characters are far from anything resembling depth or complexity. In this section, I'm going to go over each character in detail and explain what I think the major flaw in their writing is. Kinger is by far the worst character in this entire show. His entire personality is a joke, and his relationship with his wife is handled incredibly poorly. Firstly, Kinger's character serves no functional purpose to the show's story or themes. He's dead weight who the characters drag around because Sean Chiplock needs a paycheck, even though he's completely and utterly useless. From what we're told, he was the first person in the circus and that his insanity is because of that. However, the show never really acknowledges that fact, nor does it utilize it to its full potential. Any horror or even tragedy his character could have is nullified by the fact the show doesn't take his insanity seriously, usually making jokes about how incompetent or weird he is. Why should the audience be expected to take his character seriously if the show itself doesn't? It would be like if Murder Drones wanted you to take Nori's death in character seriously, only for it to be constantly making your mom jokes. Speaking of dead wives, Kinger's relationship with his wife Queenie is handled abysmally, and all of that is due to one major flaw. She serves no purpose. Her relationship with Kinger is horribly underdeveloped, and her only purpose is to give her husband an artificial tragic backstory. When he talks about her, she just seems like a generic nice wife character, with her only unique trait being her fascination with entomology, a trait that passed on to Kinger, and a running gag that really didn't need any elaboration. Another thing that makes their relationship so flat is the fact that we have no idea what they meant to each other. Kinger speaks of her fondly, but what does that say about their relationship or dynamic? We know they loved each other, but how did they express that love? Despite the show's mediocre handling of this relationship, I think Kinger and Queenie's story had potential, and for that, we have to look to another Glitch Productions character whose name starts with a K. Pawn is a character from Glitch's show Murder Drones, the father of Uzi, our protagonist, and the widowed husband of the believed-to-be-dead Nori. Khan and Nori have a similar dynamic to Kinger and Queenie, with a dead wife and grieving husband. However, the reason Khan and Nori work, whereas Kinger and Queenie don't, is the fact that, unlike the chess pieces, their relationship has an actual impact on their characters and the story. Nori was fatally wounded after an attack by a disassembly drone, so to spare her the pain of such a gruesome death, Khan was more or less forced to put her out of her misery, the ensuing trauma causing him to become emotionally distant from his daughter and spend more time at work to prevent a similar accident. The neglect caused Uzi to become colder and closed off, desperate for her father's approval, leading to her behavior that would become the inciting incident for the entire series. Nori's death has ripple effects that impact not just the characters closest to her, but the story of the show as a whole. You feasibly couldn't tell the same story without her, and that's not even taking into account what she did while alive. Kinger's story, on the other hand, feels like a bargain bin copy of Khan and Nori's. Queenie only exists to give him a tragic backstory with no purpose or reason for existing outside of that. Nori's story was carefully crafted to fit her role in the story, whereas Queenie's entire existence feels like an afterthought, existing only to give depth to an otherwise flat character. I mean, heck, what law of the universe dictates that she must be Kinger's wife? Her role in the story would be virtually unaffected if she were just a friend, or was even like his sister or something. He's also just an unnecessary character to the lineup. Unlike every other character who has a clear gimmick in terms of their design or personality, Kinger is just an anthropomorphized chess piece with a dead wife. He doesn't bounce off the other characters well, and doesn't do anything for the story of the show as a whole. Heck, he's effectively written out of episode 4 entirely, and his absence is barely even noticed. Kinger is, honestly, an exhausting character. He was a seemingly unnecessary addition to the cast I thought I would grow to find charming, only for his character to be ruined as the show tried to give him depth he didn't need, and then proceeded to squander any potential such a backstory could have, turning him from an unnecessary yet charming character to an unnecessary and poorly written character that the show simply didn't need. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Zooble is a useless character. It feels like I'm lying by even referring to them as one. The fact they do literally nothing during either the first or second episode should be proof enough. You could explain everything they've done so far in under a minute. In the pilot, they get kidnapped by the Gloinks and are the reason the cast finds the Gloink Queen. In the second episode, they don't exist. In the third episode, Kane makes an extra special spooky adventure for them, yet they still skip out, instead getting a therapy session where they reveal they have body dysphoria. And in the fourth episode, they give Gangle the MacGuffin of the week. Zooble isn't a character. They're a reason. They exist only to further the plot of any given episode, but don't have anything in the way of their own story or arc. None of what they do says anything about their personality or character, and even their therapy session in episode 3 ended up revealing more about Kane's character than theirs. Honestly, I think the only reason Goose kept Zooble around is because she simply got too attached to their design. Most of the problems with Gangle's character are consolidated into the fourth episode, which sucks because it's meant to be her episode. Essentially, in episode 4, Gangle gets a new mask from Zooble, a mask that allows her to feel normal. And during the events of the episode, this manifests in the form of Gangle being incredibly annoying and acting just as generically insane as characters like Pomni, Kinger, Jax, etc. Now, I have many problems with how the episode tried to handle its masking metaphor and how it feels tacked on and lazy, but that's a topic for another video. What I wanted to discuss here is why Gangle's writing and supposed development falls flat, and it's honestly a really simple problem. Prior to this episode, we've learned nothing about her, thus making her supposed changes in behavior anything from non-existent to incredibly difficult to notice. To emphasize what I mean, I wanted to look at a series of books with a similar formula to The Amazing Digital Circus, Wings of Fire, and specifically the character of Sunny. Now, Sunny's point of view book is the fifth book, the finale of the first arc, and her story in that book centers around her proving her worth and autonomy to dragons that see her as defective or weak, particularly her adoptive siblings, who, during the past 4 books, routinely infantilize her and dismiss her and her opinion. The difference between Sunny's story and Gangle's and why one works where the others doesn't is because of how their characters are handled prior to their respective point of view stories. In Wings of Fire, we get several instances of Sunny being ignored, devalued, or disrespected by the dragons around her, both in cruel and seemingly kind ways, and we see her exasperation at this, which helps to paint a pretty clear image of her character even when we're not in her head. She's a strong, determined dragon, desperate to prove her worth to others and fulfill her purpose even when others around her have lost hope. Man, Wings of Fire is actually a pretty goated book series. I should reread that someday. Gangle, on the other hand, has none of this. Throughout the first 4 books, she is essentially comic relief, only existing to get her mask broken and have the audience laugh at her suffering. We don't get to see how this affects her, outside of her default expression of being some kind of upset, which makes a sudden shift in episode 4 of us suddenly being expected to take her pain seriously seem jarring and out of place. It would be like if Walk consistently characterized Sunny as being mindlessly happy-go-lucky, never letting us see any emotions from her outside of that, only to drop it on us with the class and subtlety of a lead brick that, no, actually, she was super upset by the degrading comments, causing us to have to go back and retroactively assign scenes as actually having been super relevant at establishing this. Essentially, the problem with Gangle's character is the fact the show tries to portray her behavior in episode 4 as being out of character, despite the fact we barely know anything about her character. It makes a supposedly triumphant scene at the end of episode 4 ring hollow, as we have no idea what was even supposed to have been accomplished. It's a breakthrough, but we don't understand what she was meant to be breaking through. Gangle, for her own sake, honestly should have just been cut. You can tell Goose has no idea what to do with her. Jax is a confusing mess of a character, as he's ridiculously hyped by both the fandom and creator, despite having such a lacking role in the show itself. From what we're told, Jax is meant to be a class clown style bully who doesn't take anything seriously and sees everyone around him as pawns in a twisted game. However, this is very poorly represented in the show itself. Most of his bullying consists of over-the-top cartoon slapstick that's played for laughs and that barely has any effect on the story or characters. His throwing the bowling ball at Kinger and Gangle is used to push the plot along, and the two never express any opinions on being assaulted. In the CCC, Jax forces Gangle into the driver's seat and she takes to her new role without complaint. In the same episode, when it's revealed he let the fudge into the kingdom to kill everyone, it's just brushed over and more or less treated like a morbid joke. Now, if this were a simple show that reveled in how messed up its cast was and didn't take things like physical assault or murder seriously, that would be fine. In fact, the first 2 episodes really gave that kind of implication. However, come episode 3, and suddenly Jax is bound and gagged in a wheelbarrow, the implication being that this is meant to be comeuppance for his behavior in the past 2 episodes. However, this doesn't work because of the tonal whiplash it creates. The first 2 episodes, for the most part, play off Jax's antics as just jokes, with the characters they affect not being impacted by them or even having many strong opinions, period. The show exists in this weird gray area where it wants us to see Jax as a genuinely horrible person doing genuinely awful things, while simultaneously playing him off as just a goofy, quirky chaos gremlin. The main problem with Jax is that he has what I would like to call creator's pet syndrome. He's seen as so exceptionally special by the creator that he deserves extra special treatment purely on that principle. And while this usually manifests in the form of them being treated unrealistically well by the other characters, Jax's is manifested in the form of being treated like a punching bag just for the crime of being vaguely annoying. Despite this, the creator still loves him, and as a result can't take his actions seriously or criticize them in any real, tangible way, as that may make people not want to buy his skinned head. To put it simply, the biggest problem with Jackson's writing is that the show wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants the audience to see Jax as this cruel and awful person. It doesn't want to actually take his actions seriously, as doing so would involve criticizing Gooseworks' Gorbo. Ragatha is an infuriating character, as she had a lot of potential with her initial premise, yet got slowly flanderized and warped as the show progressed, eventually making her just as shallow and disappointing as everyone else in this show. Before the pilot released, everything from promotional material to Goose herself gave the impression that Ragatha was going to be this toxic positivity ray of sunshine who tried to keep everyone else happy, even when it clearly wasn't working and at the expense of her own mental health. Essentially, a less mentally stable version of Ed, and this is already a great idea for a character. It raises so many questions about her past. How did she end up like this? To get to a point where she felt the need to care for everyone around her, even when everyone else was so callous, cruel, and didn't appreciate her? Was this a trait she had as a human, or something that manifested in the circus? And if this was a trait she still had in the real world, why? Once again, Ragatha had the makings to be a great character with a lot of potential for exploration and growth. If this show were competently written, she could have had an arc about learning to be more rational about her feelings, to let herself and others express their emotions naturally and not feel the need to be everyone's protector, especially towards people who clearly don't care about her. But that's not who Ragatha ended up becoming. The pilot was the only episode of this show that did Ragatha justice. When Pomni first arrives in the circus, Ragatha is initially sweet and cordial, introducing her to her fellow cast members and trying to make her first day as enjoyable as possible. However, the mask quickly slips as she blows up his jackets in the hallway, and the unhealthy side of her behavior is revealed as she tries to argue with an abstracted Cosmo that clearly isn't open to listen. The pilot gives us the perfect introduction to Ragatha's character, showing that underneath her kind facade, she's a broken person desperate to keep the tentative peace established between the circus members. However, the rest of the series fumbles this in a major way. Her characterization is virtually identical in episode 2, however, there's a new addition that will haunt her for the rest of her story: her one-sided obsession and completely underdeveloped relationship with Pomni. Now, in the CCC, this was fine, as it manifested mostly through her making small talk with Pomni and Pomni not being too interested in the conversation, which makes sense given her previous characterization and everything that's happened prior. Yet, the real damage comes in episode 3, where Pomni takes Fear's message of the worst thing you can do is make someone feel like they're not loved, and tries to apply it to her own life, apologizing to Ragatha for not accepting her friendship, which is something we never see on screen, and the first time either Ragatha or Pomni brings this up. This one scene manages to ruin all of Ragatha's character potential, as from this moment forward, the series will double down on Ragatha's one-sided obsession. Episode 4 is the final nail in the coffin, as Ragatha gets high off stupid sauce, effectively writing her out of the plot, and while high, she mistakes Pomni being stupid with Gummy Goo as her flirting with him, and laments that she wishes someone would flirt with her. Now, she was high here, so it's entirely possible this isn't a line we're meant to take seriously, and that she'll get back on track in episode 5. However, at that point, it would be too late, as the series would have to retcon and gaslight the audience into believing Ragatha's character has been explored to any degree when it hasn't. She's been flanderized into Pomni's surrogate love interest. Another consequence of this seeming refusal to explore Ragatha's character to any significant degree is that it makes her kinda come off as a bit of a Mary Sue. What do I mean by that? Well, in episode 4, Gangle expresses that she doesn't feel comfortable talking to Ragatha because it's hard to tell how much of her behavior is genuine. Yet, none of Ragatha's behavior feels particularly ingenuine or forced. The very beginning of the episode features Ragatha playing a game of baseball with Gangle, a scene that doesn't particularly feel artificial or fake, and instead a rather kind, if simple, attempt at cheering her up. In fact, none of Ragatha's behavior feels particularly artificial or forced, especially not to the point where it could be seen as a character flaw. By all accounts, she's practically perfect, with most of the misfortune that befalls her coming as a result of some outside force. Ragatha herself doesn't have any deep-seated flaws to work through, and it's this that makes her probably one of the most disappointing characters in the show, simply due to how much wasted potential she has. Pomni is the ideal protagonist for this kind of show. Her design is uninspired, so any bootlegging plush company can easily replicate it. Her voice is obnoxious, so virtually every fan casting will sound better than the original, and she has no personality whatsoever, so anyone can project themselves onto her. In case it wasn't obvious, I do not like Pomni. Now, I don't hate her as a person, and I definitely don't hate her as a character either, mostly because there's nothing to hate. There's nothing to like either. Pomni is a boring character. There's no other way to say it, she's just boring. She has no unique traits that set her apart from the rest of the cast, and especially no traits that make her worthy of being our protagonist. And it sucks because she could have been a great one, not super deep or complex, but serviceable for this type of story. Pomni's personality in the pilot is introduced to us as a nervous, incompetent fish out of water whose cowardice causes her to do selfish things, and while not the most complex character in the world, she had potential. Now, with the personality I described to you, you'd probably think her arc would involve something along the lines of, say, growing more confident as she learns more about the inner workings of the circus. Perhaps with a secondary arc of her growing more selfless as she learns more about and develops bonds with the other characters. So, how is this arc furthered in episode 2? Well, at the beginning of the episode, she's shown to have lost her flighty and constantly anxious edge. Well, that's fine. The adrenaline of the events of the previous episode have probably just worn off by now. That's perfectly understandable. And by the end of the episode, she's emotionally stable enough to help someone with their existential crisis. Congratulations, you've ruined it. Now, I actually like this scene. It helps to flesh out Gummy-Goo, the only actual character in this show, and in general, it's just kind of sweet. However, it also manages to utterly ruin Pomni's character and any potential she has for an arc. She goes from an anxiety-ridden wet cat to a competent and capable person in the span of a single episode, even though there's been no logical through line to trigger such a change. Despite my annoyance, you could very easily justify this by saying she was simply shell-shocked by the events of the pilot and had since calmed down, an explanation that, while lazy and rather retcon-like, does make some level of sense. However, in episode 3, she goes right back to her pilot personality, being painfully incompetent and too anxious to sit still for more than a minute. Episode 3 is so bad it physically pains me to think about it, and one of those reasons is what it does to Pomni's character. To put it simply, Pomni isn't a character in episode 3. She isn't allowed to make choices, and honestly feels less like a protagonist and more like an excuse. Like she was only included to give the audience a reason to follow this story rather than the more interesting one. And finally, in episode 4, she's seemingly back to how she was in episode 2, kinda just bored and done with everything, however with hints of the flighty, insecure girl we met in the pilot, and I think you can see the problem. Pomni's characterization is incredibly inconsistent, feeling as though it changes every other episode, and in some cases, every other scene. This isn't just annoying, it's also a massive problem for her character, as it sets the standard that her behavior is going to change willy-nilly, and there's an incredibly low chance any development will stick. Essentially, the series can't have Pomni develop or go through any real arc, as it hasn't even decided who she is as a person, and this indecisiveness about her characterization results in another major problem with Pomni's writing. She's a boring character who has no right to be our protagonist. Her inconsistent characterization makes it incredibly hard to get a grasp on who she is as a person. You'd be hard pressed to try to describe her personality in any detail because her basic personality traits change virtually every episode. And the things that do stay consistent simply aren't interesting. At her core, Pomni's personality is that she's anxious and incompetent, two incredibly impersonal traits that could be applied to virtually any character and don't make her stand out as a person. I mean, heck, she's essentially just a less jittery version of Kinger and less whiny version of Gangle. Pomni has no interesting, unique, or compelling traits that tell the audience why she is the character whose perspective this story needs to be told through. To emphasize what I mean, let's look at the protagonist of Glitch Productions' other, more interesting and complex show, Murder Drones. From her very first lines of dialogue, we already get the sense this is a sarcastic and hyperbolic character, and when the camera pans out to reveal who's speaking, her introductory scene does a great job of conveying to the audience her core personality traits. She's loud and brash, passionate about her beliefs, and dismissive of the feelings of people she doesn't really care for. And just a scene later, we understand why this is. She was neglected by her father and feels abandoned by him. This backstory immediately connecting back to the behaviors we saw in the first scene. She's loud because she feels it's the only way she can get attention. She's passionate about her beliefs because she's desperate for acceptance and approval. And she's dismissive of others' feelings because she doesn't feel she owes anything to a world who's done nothing but abandon and ignore her. From the moment she's introduced, Uzi is given both a strong characterization and a backstory that explains her behavior. And unlike Pomni, this stays consistent and is built on throughout the entire series. In episode 3, we get to see her interact with and get some more insight on her relationship with her dad. And in episode 4, she admits to being nervous and fearing N will abandon her. Not to mention, also unlike Pomni, she has a linear arc that's built on throughout the show. In the pilot, she's angry, spiteful, and distrustful of virtually everyone. However, by episode 8, she's learned to let those walls down and realize there are people out there she can trust and even love. Pomni, on the other hand, has no such depth or complexity to her character. In fact, she barely has one. When she's not being a vessel for the plot, her personality can basically be summed up as caricature of what people think someone with anxiety should act like. This lack of a strong characterization not only leads to her feeling shallow, but also, frankly, makes her undeserving of being the show's protagonist. She isn't given many opportunities to show off her personality or make many decisions that show who she is as a person. She lacks any agency and feels more like an excuse for the show to follow certain plots rather than someone whose actual existence as a person matters. She feels more like a camera than a character, giving the audience a glimpse into the lives of the characters that actually matter, but not being allowed to do anything herself. This is especially emphasized in episodes 3 and 4. In episode 3, she's basically useless, as she mostly just fulfills basic tasks anyone with a functioning brain could do, and drags Kinger around like the geriatric dog he is. In fact, if this was supposed to be Kinger's episode, then why not use the opportunity to show how he handles himself when not surrounded by people who constantly insult and demean him? It's even worse in episode 4, where she's effectively just set dressing until her cringy and undeserved gummy goo flirting scene. Even the normally cliche sitting down in the dark and trauma dumping scene, which could have been used to flesh out Pomni's relationship with Gangle, is actively ignored and lampshaded about. Why should we care about your seemingly deep and meaningful scenes when you yourself mock them? Because of Pomni's shallow characterization and lack of real presence in the story, it leads to her being a character who doesn't really have much of a reason to be the show's protagonist. Most of the time, a good protagonist is one whose character is so interconnected with the story they're a part of that they are the best character through which their perspective could convey the story. Turning once again to the best show of all time, Uzi is fundamentally interconnected into the story of the show. Virtually every element of her character is, in some way, shape, or form, connected to another element of the story. Her mom was killed by a disassembly drone, leading to her dad neglecting her and spurning the mindset that caused her to kickstart the entire story, as well as literally being connected to the main villain of the show through said dead mom. There's no element of Uzi's character you could feasibly remove or change that wouldn't have massive ramifications for the story at large. This doesn't just make Uzi a great character, but also the perfect protagonist for this story. Her unique situation makes her the ideal perspective through which the story could be told. Her own angstiness is literally the inciting incident, and while I'm not trying to say N and or V's perspectives are any less valid, it would be rather difficult to shift the story to either of their points of view without a lot of necessary information getting either lost or mistranslated. You literally couldn't tell the same story without Uzi's unique blend of demonic possession and daddy issues. While N and V's perspectives could provide unique insights, we are ultimately following Uzi's story. Pomni, on the other hand, has no such depth or relevance to the story. Her only unique trait is the fact she's new to the circus, which the show basically forgets, and other than that, she has no meaningful connection to the wider story or themes. Almost any other member of the cast could replace her as the show's protagonist, and the story would remain virtually the same. Overall, Pomni is the most disappointing character in the entire show. Her personality is inconsistent and character flat, and the worst part is that these flaws are exacerbated by the fact she's the protagonist. She should have been the most compelling character of the show, but through inconsistent writing and being treated more like a prop than a character, managed to become the most insufferable. Another big problem with this show is the amount of characters and the disproportionate amount of focus they receive, both in and out of the show. So far, we've been introduced to 18 named individual characters with speaking roles. 18 characters in 4 episodes. Now, 6 of these are our leads, so when you consider that, the problem doesn't seem as bad. However, when you consider that most of our leads are boring amalgamations of traits with no depth or purpose for existing whatsoever, you end up circling back to the bloat problem. The show has way more characters than necessary, with each episode making it a point to introduce a character whose only purpose is to say 1 or 2 lines and then get unceremoniously shuffled out of the plot, with there being a whopping 3 characters like this. Ghostly, Martha, and Orbsman are 3 of the most infuriating characters in the show, as they're not characters. They exist to say a single line and then leave. You could write all 3 of them out of their respective episodes and nothing would change. Another thing that leads to the show feeling crowded is the fact that certain characters can have super interesting concepts only for these ideas to never be explored in the show proper, leading to there being a gaping hole where there should be a character. To explain what I mean, let's look at Martha, the most useless character and probably biggest waste of potential in the entire show. Now, Martha isn't actually introduced to us in the flesh, or rather spirit, but instead through her husband's tapes, where we learn that she had been killed by him in a fit of insanity as he had mistaken her for the monster he was hunting. I just gotta say it, this is a sick concept for a character. It inspires so many questions. What was her relationship with her husband like? How did she feel about his hobbies? Did she notice his decline into insanity? And if she did she ever try to pull him out? What were the events leading up to her death, and how did she feel in her final moments? It's a concept rife with angst and tragedy, and the fact she still lingers on as a ghost only makes you more curious. Does she feel any regret about her life or life choices? How does she feel about being forced to roam the halls of the place she was killed? How does she feel about her husband now that he's literally murdered her? Does she still love him? Does she ever look back on their relationship and wonder what she could have done differently? Does she feel any regret about the fact she wasn't able to save either of them? I'm not saying that Martha had to be the focal point of the episode, and I'm not even necessarily saying she had to be a sad or angsty character either, but just her getting some kind of development outside of a single three-line joke would have made her vaguely less useless. Gummy Goo sets a standard that the NPC's characters will get some level of development and matter somewhat to the story, yet Martha's entire existence is more or less a joke. I'm going to touch upon her more in a future section, but Alice from Murder Drones episode 6 is a great example of what I mean. While she doesn't contribute much to the overall story and dies in the very episode she's introduced, she is relevant and her being there actually matters to that episode. She serves as a secondary antagonist, and you really couldn't remove her without having to rewrite the episode from the ground up. Not to mention, her existence helps to not only flesh out the world building, making the world feel more vibrant and lived in, but also to flesh out the lore of Cabin Fever Labs and the character of Nori. In fact, Murder Drones is much more economical with its use of its characters, as every character is more or less introduced for a purpose, and characters don't get too much focus relative to their usage in the show. For example, characters like Rebecca, Brayden, Sam, Emily, and Darren don't get too much focus or attention from the narrative, as ultimately their only purpose is to die horribly. They don't get introduced to us as having unique backstories, only for those backstories to never be explored, and they don't get tweets dedicated to name dropping them, only for them to never get any proper focus in the episode. They serve their purpose for the story and don't leave the narrative feeling bloated. And I know what you may be thinking, but Kitty, doesn't having five whole characters whose only purpose is to die feel rather wasteful? If they just exist to get killed off before their characters can be explored, why even include them at all? Well, while it is easy to say death fodder character equals wasted character, you have to consider what each character's death represents. Uzi is overheating and desperate for respite. Her body is taken over by the Absolute Solver, having caused her to grow biomechanical wings and a tail. Uzi is barely in control of her own body and, by all accounts, isn't herself, and this newfound form isn't just terrifying, but also dangerous, as she hunts down and murders her five classmates for their oil, and ends up almost killing V as well, her life only being saved because of N's timely appearance. These characters' deaths don't just serve as dumb violence or gore for violence or gore's sake, but to highlight how dangerous Uzi can be when she lets the solver get the better of her. By getting rid of the cabin fever casualties, you wouldn't just be removing five death fodder characters, you'd also be removing any reason why we should see Solver Uzi as a danger. Murder Drones is great with how it uses characters, as every character is introduced for a purpose and serves their purpose. Antagonists exist to oppose the protagonists, support characters exist to help hold up the protagonist's stories, and certain side and background characters can help provide context to a certain concept or event, flesh out a protagonist's backstory or personality, or even just make the world feel more real and lived in. After all, real life isn't full of a bunch of nameless, faceless, posable mannequins. The amazing digital circus, on the other hand, is full of a bunch of nobodies who can't even really be called plot devices considering how little they contribute to the story. Even characters you'd think would be important, like Queenie, are more of an exercise in page filling than anything. Most of them could be taken out at no cost to the overall story, and characters like this often get way more attention outside of the show than is relative to what they actually do in it. Characters will get posts dedicated to name dropping them, cameo and merch, and will even have plushies made for them, when in the show they only get roughly 3 minutes of screen time, assuming they appear as anything other than a cardboard cutout. This show has a massive problem with its characters, both in how many there are and how they're used.
Today, it's all okay. The choice is yours.
The Amazing Digital Circus has terrible pacing. It's too goddamn slow and hinders every other element of the show. Let me explain. A day-night cycle can be incredibly effective at helping to convey passage of time. If multiple episodes take place during either the day or the night, then, unless stated otherwise, it's safe to assume they take place over multiple days, as realistically, the characters couldn't be doing that much within the span of a single 24-hour period. You don't have to be told explicitly how much time is passing, as your brain can fill in the gaps. The world of the Amazing Digital Circus does not have a day-night cycle. Night and day exist simultaneously, and there is no other consistent way of establishing a passage of time. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. If the show had more episodes, we could get a better grasp of how much time is passing in-universe. However, the show only has 9 episodes with completely nebulous time skips in between, and once again, time skips in and of themselves aren't bad. Murder Drones also feature time skips in between its episodes. However, unlike the Amazing Digital Circus, these time skips are much smaller, and you can usually gauge what happened off screen based on what the characters say and imply. Due to a lack of day-night cycle or any other significant events that could be used to track time, it leads to the show's timeline feeling incredibly fuzzy, with an indeterminate amount of time passing in between each episode, and no significant time-based events to make it feel like anything significant is happening. It leads to what could have been a unique trait of the world, instead feeling like a cheap excuse for the show to be lazy with its writing. After all, it's rather difficult to criticize the pacing for being slow or the character development nonsensical when there's no way of telling how much time is even passing. Now, I wouldn't be too concerned about the hypothetical timeline if things actually happen. However, we're practically halfway through the show and nothing of note has happened, making me question just how much time the characters spent twiddling their thumbs and speedrunning their character development. Speaking of character development, I already went over the main issues each character has in terms of their writing. However, by far the worst part of the show's character writing is the development of the characters and their relationships throughout the series. Character development barely happens on screen, and any that does is usually incredibly rushed and confusing as a result, barely making sense due to a lack of context to make what are supposed to be big, emotional, character-defining scenes make sense. To be frank, the show heavily relies on gaslighting to make itself seem more deep or complex than it is. I've already explained how episode 2 was a nightmare in terms of Pomni's arc, having her act way more sober than you would think based on the pilot. However, episode 3 isn't off the hook either, as at the end of the episode, after Kinger's cutscene, Kinger advises Pomni to try to take Ragatha's advances to heart, as she's just trying to be her friend. The episode tries to portray Pomni as in the wrong for rejecting Ragatha's pleas for friendship, even though we never see these. Most of it is just Ragatha trying to strike up conversation with an either uninterested or terrified Pomni, who obviously has more pressing worries than simple friendship. Why should Pomni be expected to befriend someone who can't even take her basic feelings into consideration? If Ragatha wants to befriend the character whose only consistent personality trait is debilitating anxiety, she should try to meet her halfway and either find or create circumstances where she feels comfortable enough to talk. An example of how this could be done is at the beginning of episode 4. If Ragatha hates Jax and we're meant to see him as a bad person, why would she be inviting him to play baseball with the person who she would know is the most common target of his bullying? By replacing Jax with Pomni, you would not only be fixing that issue, but also providing development for both their individual characters and their relationship. Plus, you could still have the exact same inciting incident. After Pomni knocks Gangle's mask off, Ragatha could walk over to her and reassure her that she shouldn't feel bad and that she did good regardless. It would make their, frankly undeserved, conversation at the end of episode 3 seem like it actually mattered, and it would make Ragatha seem less entitled to Pomni's friendship, as she would actually be putting effort into trying to understand and help her. Genuinely, I don't know how a writer could pass up such a golden opportunity. Honestly, Kinger could have redeemed himself if the show actually bothered to expand more on his and Pomni's relationship, as episode 3 really felt like it was setting up the two bonding and growing closer. Yet, he's basically written out of the next episode, and Pomni never once comments on or acknowledges his absence, rendering the previous episode even more pointless. Heck, you could have even just included a moment of her sighing wistfully and offhandedly mentioning that she wonders what Kinger is doing right now, would at least remind the audience of the character who exists. A more egregious example of the show's abysmally handled character development is in episode 4 with Gangle and Zooble's relationship. I already went over why episode 4 is disappointing in terms of Gangle's character development, but another thing the episode does is introduce the friendship between Gangle and Zooble, and this is simply baffling. The two never even acknowledge each other's existence before this episode, yet the show acts like the two characters whose personalities are hates everyone and scared of everyone could somehow become BFFs overnight. They get no proper on-screen establishment or development, which somehow makes their supposed friendship feel artificial and forced, like Goosh just needed an excuse to keep Zooble relevant to the plot. Virtually no character development happens off-screen, so the show has to retroactively insist that any changes are happening whatsoever to these characters and their relationships, making development feel rushed at best and artificial at worst. This show could not be subtle if it tried. Any and all information is conveyed to the audience through the most ham-fisted exposition possible, making the show feel simply shallow and unintelligent. Now, exposition isn't inherently bad, and there are ways it can be done well. In the very first episode of the show, we're introduced to the setting and concept by having each character exposit a little bit of information. Unlike later episodes, this works. It works because in this context, this information is being conveyed to a person who has no clue about any of this. It feels natural and it makes sense in universe. Episode 2 also features a lot of exposition, mostly in terms of gummy goo, where he has to explain the motive behind the syrup heist to Max and Chad, even though they probably should have already known if they had agreed to this. While it does feel a little bit awkward, I'm mostly willing to give it a pass because of the inherently absurd nature of the show. Episode 3 is, once again, the episode where the problems begin to crop up. To be frank, the episode is majority exposition. Between the tapes and Kinger's everything, most of the dialogue in the episode consists of some form of spelling out information. However, large portions of this dialogue are either completely unnecessary or very poorly conveyed to the audience. Almost all of the lore we learn about the Mildenhalls is pointless to the overall show, and even to the episode itself, as when we meet the two, one is a corpse, the other is a ghost, and both are jokes. And Kinger's exposition dump about Queenie's abstraction takes away from a situation that could have had a lot of tragedy. We could have been shown through Kinger's behavior how much he misses his wife. He could have told us the story of her abstraction, but nothing about the darkness, so the audience could put the pieces together themselves. It would have made Kinger feel like an actual person, and Queenie feel like an actual presence in the story. Also, in episode 4, Gangle just outright says that she was a shift manager when she was a human, says that she's having a manic episode, and later has to pause the episode to explain that she was a wannabe webcomic artist. 3 moments that only raise the question as to why the other characters don't just spell out whatever's happening to them at any given moment. This show could not be subtle if you paid it to be. To emphasize how subtlety and letting the audience come to their own conclusions can enhance storytelling, let's look at Alice from Murder Drones episode 6. Now, on the surface, Alice is a pretty simple character, just a shallow side antagonist who only exists to pad out the episode's runtime. However, in just the few minutes of screen time she gets, she manages to become a very interesting and fleshed out character. Her very first line of dialogue is her referring to our main characters as circus slickers, and when looking at her overall design and behavior, it's pretty easy to tell she's been down here practically isolated for a while. Her stolen tail and oven full of pores indicate that she's had multiple run-ins with disassembly drones in the past, an idea exacerbated by the field of corpses at the entrance to the labs, and when the characters finally get a chance to talk to her, she reveals that she has a sour view of disassembly drones and a less than favorable history with Nori in particular, speaking of her with a very cold and sarcastic tone, and upon recognizing Uzi as her daughter, begins to taunt and torture her, showing that she had a rough past and some rough experiences with Nori specifically. Her using Uzi as an infinite finger generator shows that she's both sadistic and resourceful, and her FNAF desk shows that she's adapted to a life of hiding. Later, when Tessa is manipulating N, she pulls up a photo of the labs when they were active, featuring Nori, Yiva, and Alice being interrogated by a human, with Nori cockily leaning against a sentinel and Alice's face smashed against the wall. And without having to say anything, this immediately makes everything fall into place. When the labs were active, Nori bullied Alice, and probably some of the other drones there as well, causing Alice to grow resentful towards her, and now that she has her daughter, she now seeks to torture her as a form of cathartic revenge. And the best part? None of this has to be told to the audience directly. It's very easily inferred based on a combination of what's said, shown, and implied. Alice doesn't have to pause the episode to exposit her backstory or explain why she hates Nori or has it out for Uzi. The episode does a great job of conveying to the audience her past and personality through show don't tell storytelling. Isn't it amazing how much depth you can squeeze into a single character when your show actually has the ability to be subtle? Once again, exposition isn't inherently bad. However, the show uses exposition as a crutch rather than a tool. It doesn't trust the audience to understand any vaguely complex idea and thus feels the need to explain everything. Not exactly beating the kids' show allegations when you constantly feel the need to hold your audience's hand and walk them through critical thinking. This show is incredibly tonally confused, whiplashing between goofy slapstick and serious, deep emotional moments on a dime. And most of this is due to how the show handles morality, specifically the moralities of its characters. The show was originally pitched as being about exploring the flaws of its main characters. However, much like a lot of other things the show promised, it failed to deliver, instead choosing to tell a comedic story where no character's actions are taken seriously, and Jax is the embodiment of this flaw. The show's creator and other outside sources repeatedly insist that Jax is a bad person, but when you look at his actions within the world and morality system the show presents, it's hard to really call his actions bad. In the pilot, he steals Zooble's arm and throws a bowling ball at Kinger, causing him and Ragatha to fall into the Glint Queen's lair. However, outside of minor annoyance from Zooble, no character seems very affected by this behavior. In the CCC, he forces Gangle to drive and lets the fudge into the kingdom to eat its citizens. However, Gangle never seems to be upset at the forced position, and we never get to see nor feel the effects of the fudge's attack, making Jax's behavior in this episode ring hollow. In episode 3, he sucks up Ghostly, although Ghostly was a plot device who never should have existed in the first place, so kinda based honestly. However, he then chucks Gangle's comedy mask into the horror door, with that being the extent of his bad behavior for that episode. And, as of now, in episode 4, he dunks Ragatha in the fry oil. That's literally it, and it's forgotten about after a minute. Now, on paper, one could easily see how these actions could be interpreted as bad. After all, he's directly harming other characters for no valid reason. Yet, this idea completely falls apart, as his actions don't have enough of a tangible effect on either the world or characters to really emphasize to the audience that they're bad. The characters he hurts recover from their mistreatment in mere seconds and never seem to have any real feelings about it after the fact. Combined with the fact the characters can't be injured and any and all damage caused to the environment is temporary, the show does a very bad job of convincing you that Jax's behavior is supposed to be seen as bad in universe. In fact, the other characters do things that are just as bad, if not worse, than the things Jax does, yet they get off completely fine. In the pilot, Zooble strangles Jax to the point he falls to the floor. In episode 3, Jax is seen bound and gagged, and while we technically don't know who did it, the culprit is heavily implied to be Ragatha. And in episode 4, Jax is straight up tortured and is shown to have been disturbed by this process. The problem isn't that the show has the characters do bad things, it's how their actions are framed in universe. And in universe, there's no reason why their cruelty should be treated any differently than Jax's. Yet, because of his creator's pet syndrome, he's seen as a special kind of evil due to the crime of being the creator's go-to character for a doodle sheet. Once again, if the show was lighthearted and didn't take itself seriously, I'd be fine with this double standard. However, when you tell me to think, I'll think, and when you think, you realize the show is borderline hypocritical in its treatment of characters' suffering and wrongdoing. Now, before we wrap up the video, I just wanted to ask, why? Why do I think the show turned out like this? Well, honestly, I think most of the show's issues can be tied to one simple reason. The show is trying to do too much. It wants to have way more characters than necessary, wants to tackle more complex themes than the writer can handle, wants to make each character super deep and complex, but simply doesn't have the time to explore them properly. The show is simply trying to do too much given its scale, which makes it feel confused and aimless, like nothing here truly matters. I, for one, think the show would have done much better if Goose had a co-writer, someone who wasn't as deeply attached to literally every single character and idea, and would have had the guts to cut what simply didn't work. Plus, a second perspective could have given Goose an audience's eye view to see how certain elements may be interpreted by someone who doesn't have all the context. Who knows? Maybe I'm just judging the show prematurely and need to give it time to show its true colors. But I find it hard to want to give the show a chance when we're practically halfway through the season and nothing substantial has happened. For one final comparison, at the same point in Murder Drones, most of our relevant characters had gotten some kind of development. We had gotten introduced to a new antagonist and subtly foreshadowed the endgame villain. Murder Drones spent the first half of its season setting things up so that the later half of the season could pay those things off. TADC, on the other hand, is all payoff with no setup. So, what's my overall verdict on the amazing digital circus? Well, to put it simply, I just think the show needs to pull itself together and seriously figure out what story it's trying to tell, because as it stands, the show has no real redeeming qualities that give me a reason to stay invested. If I were to continue watching, what would I even have left to look forward to? Character arcs that appear and disappear at will, relationships that sprout up and die off like weeds, pointless characters that only exist to flex Goose's character design skills. There's nothing here of substance to keep me engaged. I'll probably keep watching just to see what happens, but honestly, I don't think I can say I like the show anymore. Honestly, I'm just disappointed. Anyway, that's all for me. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all next time.